along and joining us for this incredibly rich discussion by one of our much loved leaders of our researchers in our school, Yazdan Mansourian. And Yazdan will be speaking to us today about, I've lost the thing, Ricoeurean reading of Serious Leisure through Selfhood, Otherness and the Narrative Identity. So before we get underway, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we live and work together, and pay our respects to elders within First Nations communities, and acknowledge the continuity of cultures, languages, leadership and knowledge systems. We recognise First Nations people's continuing connection to country and value their contribution to our communities. So thank you so much for joining us wherever you should be joining us from. I'm coming to you from Dharawal country in Wollongong today, but please put your traditional country in the chat if you wish. So to Yazdan, welcome, and I'll just give you a brief introduction because we have the bio attached as well, but Dr. Yazdan Mansourian is a senior lecturer in the School of Information and Communication Studies here at Charles Sturt University. He received his PhD in Information Science from the University of Sheffield in 2006. Since then, his research interests have been shaped around the cognitive and affective aspects of information behaviour in different contexts. Since 2017, he's focused on information behaviour in the context of serious leisure, a topic with which we are all quite jealous. In this ongoing research program, he explores the role of joy and other positive emotions in engaging people with hobbies, amateurism and voluntary activities, and how joyful experience inspire them to seek, share and use information. Thank you so much, Yazdan, for presenting your latest thoughtful piece to us, and I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and hello everyone. Thank you for attending the presentation. Those colleagues who are here in person in Building 5 in Wagga Wagga campus, probably the last meeting we will have here because we are moving to a new building, and colleagues and other friends who are online joining us. Thank you for being here. So today I'm going to talk about how I use Paul Ricoeur ideas in my research. So 2 months ago, on 11th of February, I talked about how I use his philosophy in my teaching. Now I am using the same theoretical framework for my research, because it's very productive and you can do everything with that theoretical framework. It's about identity, narrative identity. So that's the main idea. So Paul Ricoeur, French philosopher, very famous in hermeneutics and many other areas in philosophy, especially his wonderful ideas about narrative identity that I will explain what it is, and that's what I'm focusing on. So one of my favorite quotes from him is, "I find myself only by losing myself." So very paradoxical. And the main question is, who am I? So basically, to understand narrative identity, we need to ask, who am I? So I'm inviting you to think about this question and consider this point that, can you introduce yourself without any reference to the past? Is it possible? Just think about it. Can you introduce yourself, understand your sense of self without any reference to the past? Yeah.
Depends on the context.
Yeah, of course, it depends on the context, but if you are talking about identity, so because when we say, who am I? This I can be different things. It can be self, as someone that I know myself and other people know me, or it can be a spiritual. But in general, when we are talking about identity, our identity always connected to the past in one way or another. And how we actually answer this question is always in a form of a story. It's a narrative. So I remember 9 years ago, I was in the same room here, sitting over there. And then I was introducing myself to the school. Some of you have been here before me, so you may remember that. And I answered this question, who am I? And I said, this is my name, this is my educational background, this is where I used to work. And so it was a narrative about myself. So answering this question, who am I, is always a story. And then the other aspect is, can you think of, I stay here, can you think of any answer for this question, who am I, without being part of a group? So just think about it. Who am I? Whatever answer you say, is it possible that it doesn't belong to any group? So for example, if I say I am a lecturer, it means I am one lecturer, a lecturer among thousands of lecturers around the world. If I say I am a man, I am one of men around the world. If I say I am Iranian, I am one among 90 million. Whatever I say, if I say I am a father, husband, whatever.
As a writer, you're right. Even if you only write your story, you're amongst people writing their own.
Exactly. And interestingly, not only about my identity, even if we are talking about our feelings, which is very personal, is still we are always part of a group. So if I say I am happy, I am one of the happy people at the moment on the planet. If I say I am sad, I am again one of sad people. So there is no way out of it. We are always belong to a bigger group than us. So at the end, what is the conclusion of that? Our identity is always narrative and collective. Narrative and collective. So there is a story we tell about the world and about ourselves, which is part of a bigger group. So belongingness actually plays a very important role here. So who am I without a story? Impossible. Who am I without belonging to a group? Again, I should say, when I say I mean I as an identity, you know. Otherwise, in a spiritual realm, you know, when I say I as Dasein, as Heidegger says, just being aware of the world, just sitting there, forgetting about the past, that's a different thing. So by I here, I mean the identity. So our identity is always narrative and collective. And even if I say, how are you today, as I said earlier, your answer again will be based on a story. Because if I feel happy today, I am telling a joyful story to myself. If I am sad, I am telling a sorrowful story to myself. Because our feelings and emotions always is a reaction of our body to our thoughts. It's called emotion. Did you notice the word motion in that? So it's just the body shows reaction to to thoughts. So whatever we feel is always the result of what we are thinking about. And the way we think is very, very similar. So our happiest stories is very similar. Our sad stories is very similar. So if I won a lottery ticket today, I will be happy, and everyone else who actually won will be happy. So again, you can see how the concept of belonging plays a role. So narrative identity. So that was the introduction about narrative identity. Identity is shaped through stories we tell about the world and our lives, not only personal, social, about politics, about economy, about everything. The story we tell, and the story the media tells us. You know, you turn on the television, you see a story and it makes you sad. You see another story and it makes you happy. We connect past, present, and future to create meaning and coherence. That's part of the narrative identity. We always consider our life as a movie, or, you know, a very long novel that it had a past, and we have an imagination about what might happen in future. And then we have an understanding of sense of self here, right now. And these stories are not fully under our control and always influenced by culture, memory, and society. So this concept of I really doesn't belong to me as a person. And this is the same for everyone. So when I say I assume but it's not really mine. This is that came out of a story through a cultural, social, political, environmental context. And that's the beauty of that. Why? Because it's always dynamic. It's changing all the time. Little changes, big changes, but it's changing. It's changing. So if I say, I have been in this room 9 years ago talking about myself, and now I'm talking here again, the same room, am I the same person? Yes and no. Yes, my name is still Yazdan Mansourian. My date of birth didn't change, but I even look very different. So, so, and I have new ideas. Some of them I had in that time, but that I changed. So, am I the same person? Yes and no. That's the beauty of that. At the same time, I am the same person. I'm a very different one. So, so that's the beauty of that. So that was narrative identity. Now, interestingly, we have narrative literacy. I don't know whether you have heard about it or not. That was new for me, basically. It's the ability to understand and construct stories to make sense of experiences. So in all this qualitative research, grounded theory, phenomenology, case studies, ethnography, when we are researching, we're really researching people's stories and how they understand their own stories. And the ability to understand and construct that is part of the narrative literacy. Looking for a structure, perspective, turning points in narratives, because, you know, when you look back at your life over the past years, you see there have been always some turning points in a moment, in a day. You know, sometimes we had a moment of epiphany, we realized something, and then our life is different totally since then. An understanding of the past experience and present meaning and future possibility always happens under this literacy. So, so that's end of the introduction about narrative identity. Now, how I use it in my research. So, as you know, my research is about serious leisure. And to consider a leisure activity serious, we have 6 criteria, and 2 of them is very narrative. So, because um, in serious leisure, when I give you a very quick definition of that, all the leisure activities that which are sufficiently challenging but adequately rewarding, and you have commitment to do that, and you pay, you consider time and effort and invest on that, and these are the criterias: perseverance and commitment, potentiality to turn into a career, significant personal effort, durable personal and social benefits, and these two that I highlighted, unique ethos within a social world, and personal and social identity. So basically, our identity is narrative, and in this narration, in this story, our leisure activities plays an important role. So that's how I connect narrative identity into my research. So all these examples of serious leisure, from pottery to stamp collecting to bird watching, beekeeping, if when you think about them, or bonsai growing, that I have done research about some of them, bonsai growing, beekeeping, and bird watching and pottery. So regarding my research, they had very different identities. So bonsai growers were, people, you could see that in the way they talk, their story, their understanding of the world. It was very different from, for example, bird watchers. So I could see that. So by the new lens of narrative identity, when I look at the same data collection, I can see many new things. So how it happens? Basically, our serious leisure always begins with curiosity and attention. We pay attention, we become curious about something, we pay attention to it, and if we continue for a while, then we will be passionate about it, and we will find some pleasure doing it. And then we can eventually make meaning out of it. So curiosity, passion, pleasure, and purpose. And then it continues, and then it forms a story. So when I interviewed the bonsai grower who has been doing this hobby for half a century, he had such a long story to tell me. So many things happened in that half a century, and everything was somehow related to bonsai growing. So I could see bonsai growing is embedded in his identity. He could, and when they said to me, "You never own a bonsai owns you," that was so fascinating. The bonsai owns you. The little tree sitting there, people even probably don't notice that, but that tree owns me. you know how fascinating it is. Then you see the role of leisure. And then, interestingly, in my research, I realized having a hobby can potentially save your life or rescue lives of others. So it goes beyond identity. And I give you a very real example. I don't know how many of you remember this photo. I give you a clue. It happened in 2018. Thailand. Well done. Thailand. It was a rescue mission in Thailand. Impossible rescue mission. That who did it? Two hobbyists. More than two, of course, but it started with two of them. So basically, a group of young soccer players trapped into a cave in Thailand, and no one could rescue them because it was so dangerous, because after a huge flood they were trapped inside the cave and there was no way to reach them. And who rescued them? A number of people that their hobby was cave diving. Yes, so Richard um, Stanton and Robert Charles Harper and other people arrived there, and then there was a global call for help, and they formed a rescue team, and they managed to do an impossible mission. They made it possible. So, and then when after they came back to Australia, I remember they were talking to them, media had an interview with them, and they said, it was our hobby, you know. We never did it because we had to, or it was not our job, but because they loved it, they were very, very good at it. So, and that's other photos of them. Amazing, amazing story, very inspiring. Right. So basically, my research shows that serious leisure in general and serious leisure in particular creates a narrative space for us. And then it provides a framework for storytelling, and people integrate the leisure activity into their life narrative. And this repetition of these activities and reflecting on what they do reinforce this identity. And again, the identity always connected to others, formed in relation to others, and is part of the social interaction. So now I give you another example. The leisure activity that we choose is very much compatible with the story we tell about ourselves. I'll give you an example here. Fox hunting is a traditional leisure activity which is thankfully banned in some countries, including the UK. It came from the UK, but in 2004 it was totally banned. But right or wrong, I'm not here to judge it in that way. Traditionally, it was a hobby. And it was a huge argument, I remember, because I was a PhD student in England in that time, among people who were against it or supporting it, and eventually it's banned. In Australia, it's still legal, but mainly not for leisure, because fox considered as pests, and farmers who own a land, they are allowed to hunt foxes as pests. But traditionally, if we still consider it as a hobby, it will conflict with the love of animals for people who have pets, or not necessarily having pets. Those who love animals basically consider it as a cruel leisure activity. So because they believe it creates it basically it's harmful to animals, and it's contradictory with their values. So for example, I can't be a fox hunter. Or another example, not that extreme, a little bit less contradictory, but still controversial, greyhound racing. It's happening still in Australia. Some people doing it, but some people don't like it. And the argument is going on because they believe that there are some evidence that those people who are involved in these racing, because of the pressure, financial pressure, they treat these poor dogs badly. So it's not all about racing. It's much more than that. It's huge money coming into this, and then it makes it very controversial. So for me, for example, I can't kill the cousins of rebel. So I can, and we have one of them here present. So thank you for being here. So as you can see, David Bowie is here. So yeah, Casey can show him enjoying his afternoon nap. So that's a very clear example. That's how our values, our identity actually can basically form our leisure choices and what we choose for our leisure. The other example, collecting as a hobby, because in my research, I categorized hobbies into 4 categories. I published a paper in 2020 about that in AALIA. Hobbies that are just for observing, like photography, bird watching. So you are not doing anything, you are observing. Tourism, or collecting. When you collect things, people collect so many things, more than 165 things that people collect. You can't imagine that people collect whatever, from a stamp to books to pens, pencil, everything. And then making, when we make something like cooking, gardening, and then performing, like dancing, singing, things like that. So talking about collecting, for someone who has a minimalist preference, then collecting is not a good hobby, because collecting clashes with their identity as a minimalist. If you are not collecting many things in your house, and you admire simplicity and less attachment. Again, very simple example, because for those people who collect things, they have such a huge, deep attachment to what they collect, because they spend time, money. It's part of their story. And if someone prefers having less attachment, then that person is not a good collector. So another example. So conclusion. What's I'm concluding here? Basically, leisure in general provides a framework for storytelling. That's my main conclusion today. Leisure provides a framework for a storytelling, and a storytelling forms our identity. And people integrate leisure activity into their narratives, and it reinforces their identity. It becomes a way to express their values. That's very important. And it helps distinguish who I am from who I am not. Who I am and who I am not. And leisure creates a sense of continuity across life. And it reflects personal desire and social influence, because the social norms, cultures can dictate us. There are some certain kinds of leisure activity which is totally forbidden in many cultures. You can't even talk about it, but it can be done in other parts of the world. So again, this lens of a narrative identity reminded me that how social is leisure. And then it opens a new window in my research. And thank you for your attention. These are some references, and any question or comments? Thank you.
Open to the floor. This is very formal. Thank you so much, Yazdan, for that. We always leave feeling like I see the world differently after listening to you present your work. So thank you for that. Has anybody questions? Yeah, Asim.
Asim, yeah.
Should I turn off the mic or?
Yes, please.
Turn off the mic. Thanks, Yazdan, for being very, reflective in your presentation. It's not more of a question, but rather than a. Oh, fair enough.
If you mute
Yes.
and a speaker as well.
If one, then your function key.
Yeah. I think everyone in the room should actually turn off their speakers and mute. Yeah.
Thank you. So it's more, I think, of a comment when I was listening to this. So the first comment is actually there are metaphysical assumptions which philosophers make, depending on which philosophers you are following. So depending on if a metaphysical assumption about the nature of human being is that human being is a physical and I would say a material being, but it's not a spiritual being.
Yeah.
So if a philosopher is making those metaphysical assumptions about the nature of the human being, then the conclusions they will make about everything which is going to come afterward will reflect that.
Definitely.
So, and I will give you an example. You mentioned hobby is going to save the person, right?
Yeah.
But if a metaphysical assumption is about the human being is a spiritual, physical, and material being, then the person will take the next step in the reasoning and they say hobby is a mean in between because there's an ultimate being who is going to provide that, safety. So this is one thing. I think we need to acknowledge that it goes back to the metaphysical assumptions. Second thing I would like to mention, and that is about the nature of the categories.
The nature of what, sir?
Categories.
Yes.
Actually, number of the categories. And again, from a philosophical standpoint, it's good to develop categories because we can classify an experience and we can think about and talk about that experience. But we also know that the more categories we create, it actually divides also the thought and divides actually it weakens our ability to have a higher level of abstraction. So for example, narrative literacy, I thought we could have done without it also.
Yes.
So because what it does, it actually forces the self to think about in more and more divergent ways about its own reality. And self actually, again, going back to metaphysical assumptions,
Yeah.
if the self is spiritual, physical, and material being, then self needs to think about in that unified sense about itself. So yeah, so just these two comments I just wanted to make about you.
Thank you, Wasim. Thank you. And these are very relevant, what you said, and I totally agree that. First of all, Paul Ricoeur philosophy is one of many lenses that you can use because what I'm using from his theoretical framework is the concept of narrative identity. Because when we are talking about identity, we can define identity in many, many ways. And then talking about I or self, again, is a huge area in psychology, in cultural studies, in spiritual studies, spiritual practice. When I say who am I, then I'm just looking at it from a narrative identity, because no one knows, no one can answer this question eventually. Who am I? So yeah.
But it is, I would disagree on that no one can answer this question because it depends again on the metaphysical.
Yeah, no one can answer in a way that everyone's agree.
Yes.
Yes.
But there are people who will say yes. There's a large number of people across the swath of the populations who would say we know who we are. Right?
Definitely, yes, definitely. Yeah, it depends where you start. So yeah, I totally agree. Thank you, Wasim. Any more questions or comments?
Do you actually have a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, Anita, you're right.
Thanks, Vic. Thanks for the great presentation.
My
Got me
pleasure.
thinking.
You're welcome.
On Wednesday afternoon, which is really hard. But anyway, it brings me back actually to a few years ago when you talk about narrative identities. I suppose my question is, a few years back, I came across this concept of conjoint and disjoint model of society, which leads to different, I guess, generation of identity, where the conjoint model is pretty much what you were talking about. We are who we are, shaped by whatever or whoever is around us, the context. Whereas the disjoint model argues that we are coming from inside out.
Yes.
Right. So are you suggesting that the narrative identity, the narrative, approach is putting an emphasis more on the conjoint model where we have less of a say on who we are and we're determined by whatever external factors that's coming in?
Yes. And the external factor is otherness, So I have already mentioned the concept of Ubuntu, which is an African philosophy. Basically, it says, I am because you are. You are because I am, because we are. So basically, it's a combination of both. We can't actually, it's two sides of the same coin, these two approaches that you mentioned. So, but at the end of the day, as you can see in the title, selfhood and otherness are two sides of the same coin that eventually creates our identity, because you can't separate them with each other. When I say I, there must be you or someone else that distinguishes between I and someone else. So it's a play between these two. But
so yes, then sorry, but then the question of the other, the answer of the otherness, then will again depend on the metaphysical assumption.
Of course,
right?
Yeah. That paradigm never disappears.
I think this is being a very, very important issue, that a lot of the education and the knowledge which is in the content, not in the content, in the last 115 years, which is coming through, it is coming from a certain metaphysical assumption.
Oh, yes.
All of it.
There is no way out of it, yeah.
And I think we need to acknowledge that it is actually subverting, to a great extent, there's an alternative understanding of what actually is a human being,
Yeah, that paradigm always exists, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Pete Simmons.
Thank you, Vic, and thank you also, Yazdan. I found that really interesting, Yazdan, in that, as Victoria said at the beginning, it just made me think differently about things, and particularly leisure. And I was very interested in, I guess, situating myself. I mean, so I sort of picked this up. I'm situating myself in your thoughts.
Yeah.
And I just want to ask you a question about your definition of serious leisure, because what I found was that one of the points said that I can't remember the exact words, but it was
sufficiently challenging, adequately rewarding.
Potentially to turn into a career. Potentially to turn into a career. And so when I was, as you went through that, I found that sort of distracted me a little bit from perhaps your focus on identity and narrative, because I started to wonder, well, do I actually have any serious leisure? And because I was thinking about sort of my own very sort of limited capacities in terms of painting, running, guitar, tennis. They're all leisure that I enjoy.
Yes.
But are they, by your definition, seriously? Because none of them are really realistically potentially a career.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for being here. If you remember, we had a discussion about my research 8 years ago when I just started, and I'm very glad you are here.
Well, I'm so glad. It's a wonderful field. It's a very important field. I think a lot of people would be very interested. So anyway, thank you.
That's a very good question. Basically, my focus is on serious leisure to have a limit in my study. Otherwise, without considering the seriousness of leisure activity plays the role, because we have a spectrum. On one side is casual leisure, and on the other side, at the other end, when the leisure becomes a career. And in the middle is serious leisure. Okay. So if you look at this slide, I bring the main definition, these 6 criteria. But the point is, for everyone who is engaged in these leisure activities, it's not necessarily to have all of them in the full extent. It might be because people have their leisure activity. They are in the different stages of their leisure. Some of them are beginning, some of them in the middle, some of them are just becoming very expert. So to answer your question, these two topics are independent on their own.
Okay.
So I'm bringing them together for the purpose of my research, but at the end of the day, they are very independent topics. And regardless of people's involvement in leisure activities, regardless of the level of their engagement, their leisure always play a role, even if it's a casual leisure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. Your point about the sort of spectrum makes
Yes.
sense. So thank
That
you.
spectrum.
And
yes,
thanks again.
My pleasure, Peter.
Is it,
Rachel.
Kit has a question
Sorry,
here.
Kit or
Yeah.
Rachel, whoever wants to go first.
thank you, sorry,
Rachel next.
I just, I was wondering if it's less the potential for you personally to turn it into a career than rather the potential for it to be a career generally, if taken to its logical extreme. Yeah, because, you know, I would classify the choir singing that I do as fairly serious leisure. I perform, I work,
Yes.
but it is not something that I will never be a professional singer.
Of
But
course.
yeah, but I also just wanted to say, you know, as someone who has quite a lot of life writing, living, you know, published, static out in the world, and I look back on some of the stories that I have narrativized about myself and my identity, and, you know, 5-10 years later, I am a completely different person in many ways. So I really appreciate the use of Ricoeur to sort of framework that tension of constructing yourself, because, you know,
Yeah.
5 years ago I was a disabled woman, and now I'm, you know, non-binary. It's like, how do I re-narrativize that story? But the other thing I was thinking about was in a serious leisure context, when there are tensions within a community. So say, for example, gaming.
Yes.
A lot of, you know, many people will identify as gamers and have very different identities based upon how they entered that space and what they associate with it. So sort of this, there was an incident about 10 years ago, it was called Gamergate. It was
Yeah.
a very big identifying moment between who was a gamer and who wasn't, and also and how people define themselves. And I think it's really fascinating to be able to look at community schisms like that through this narrativizing
Yeah.
space. I think fandom would also be a big
Yes,
space for
sure.
that, because, you know, how people, there are lots of people who write fan fiction, for example, but there's always huge discourse about, you know, what is or is not appropriate, or, you know, within community.
Definitely. If you remember, I had another presentation last year about dark side of serious leisure, and in that presentation I mentioned that this dedication can turn into obsession. So that is spectrum can goes on and on and on, and again, all these cultural, social, political power, in general, more important power, these are elements playing a role in reality. So my next presentation hopefully will be about the influence of power on leisure, something that is almost being neglected, overlooked in the literature, because we assume that we are free to choose our leisure, but we are not free. I'm not saying at all, but, you know, we are not free in many aspects. So the concept of, and when I say power, I mean all forms of power: political power, financial power, cultural
I
power.
think gaming would be a really good lens for that.
Yes.
Between the sheer price of peripherals
Yes.
and equipment, but also, you know, the types of games that are being developed and promoted and who play them.
Exactly. Yeah. And interestingly, the more I spend time on this topic, every year I realize it becomes more complicated. So when I look at my, for example, first presentations about serious leisure 8 years ago here, again, the same room, I was so excited about it. I'm still excited, but I realized that I had a very simplistic view of that. I was not serious enough about serious leisure. So it was not as positive, as simple, as bright that I imagined at the beginning. Then eventually I noticed the dark sides coming, and so hopefully I'm not going that towards that dark, very dark sides. But next time, hopefully, I will talk about power and leisure here.
Rachel.
Well, I actually had a very similar observation in terms of this idea of, say, the immersion for some people in gaming, but also the emergence of esports and this idea of differentiating a hobby from a career through its monetization being an incomplete process. And I would say the similar sort of comparable would be things like Olympics, where Olympic athletes, unless they've won a big prize, they don't really have a lot of money. There's a kind of weird sort of space there between pursuing something as a passion with a drive that is probably a little bit more focused than I can imagine, and something that would be a hobby. That's, I mean, choosing to strive to be an Olympic athlete is not a hobby, but it's also not really a job. So there's a kind of weird space there where there's, within the kind of sense of other and otherness, there are other ways to sort of have outliers. And I did wonder, in terms of the framing of othering provided here in this, how that sort of varies from, say, Baudrillard's framing through something like radical alterity, or things like différance. When you look into other writers, when we're talking about this idea of other, it comes up so commonly in different philosophical frameworks, but there tends to be little nuances. And this particular space that you are exploring in this work, how would you differentiate? How would you other this other?
Before I answer this, I would like to answer the first part, because this is one of the most frequent questions that people ask me, for example, in interviews in the media, that where is the border line between leisure and work? Where is it? Because I always say it's a blurred border, but there is a border. There is a point, and that's sense of agency and autonomy. I believe that leisure is liberty. Leisure is liberation. Whatever we do, because we like, because we want, and there is no other element playing role, or the other elements have smaller roles, that's our leisure. So when we exercise our sense of agency in the fullest capacity and we feel liberated, that's leisure. So autonomy. For people who become professional in their sport, it's not their sense of agency anymore. There is theirs, but it doesn't have that bigger role, because they have to consider the situation, the context, the game, all those who are influencing, impacting on the context, media, politicians, and then finance, everything. And then at the end of the day, they are not who they are. It becomes work, yes. So that's the first part. The other thing about otherness, again, how we define otherness again is important. And you mentioned difference, as I had a presentation about Jacques Derrida.
Mhm.
So different roles, different lens. We can look at it. The terms that I'm using in this title, I am aware how broad they are, and people use the same terms in very different contexts,
Mhm.
and I do my best to differentiate what I mean by them here in this context. But to summarize my point, what I'm really looking at here is to what extent our identity affects on our choice for leisure and how our leisure forms our identity, because this is a two-way process. It happens at the same time. Peter have a question.
Oh,
Sorry, it might be too late to ask this question, but you mentioned sport then, and immediately reminded me of these thoughts that I've had for many years without ever really trying to flesh them out. But some people, and I'm thinking about particularly contact sport, rugby and soccer that I'm familiar with, where you have these people who on the field are, to be quite frank, violent. They will do whatever it takes to win the game, and if violence is part of that, they will do that. And yet off the game and yet away from the game, they might be very, they're sort of regarded as very gentle folk, and people often make these observations about sports people, they're on the field an animal, a wild animal, but off the field a gentleman sort of thing. Where does that fit into this and leisure and identity in your, are you able to sort of briefly tackle that?
Oh yes, it's not their serious leisure anymore. That's their career. That's their profession, and the concept of serious leisure doesn't address that, because it has all the contradiction with that those 6 criteria.
Sorry, can I just interrupt you there? But I'm not just thinking about professionals here. In fact, I'm only really thinking about amateurs. I'm not thinking about professional sports people.
Yeah.
Is on and off.
Yes. Oh, yeah. In that case, that's the dark side of serious leisure. It becomes an obsession. So, because when you look at the leisure scholarship, they have done lots of research about passion, pleasure, purpose, and scholars are a bit reluctant to talk about the other aspects, because we are promoting leisure in general, but it's not always positive. So that's less explored area in this field.
Great. We like to hear about them. Thank you.
Yes.
There's a door for you, Pete. Walk right in.
Great door.
Yeah, big door. What a wonderful, rich and diverse discussion. We've got a few minutes left, about 5 or so. If anybody has anything else they wanted to add, I was going to ask you about what's next. You've just sort of answered that, Yazdan, with your talk about power.
Power is the next. Yes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Have you got a publication in mind or a project that you're working on that we could hear about?
Yeah, actually, I have written a paper. It's under review at the moment about the connection between power and leisure. And I realized how naive I was when I began this research, because I didn't think about power at all. And then I realized power is sitting in the darkness and, telling us what to do and what not to do.
So will you draw on Karl Marx, some of the ideas he had about power?
I looked at it mainly from Michel Foucault perspective. And then, I would say when we look at leisure from the perspective of power, that's the most realistic perspective, because in reality, power tells everything, but power remains invisible. Mainly, yeah, not all the time, yeah. So it's fascinating. The area that I'm again very naive in that. So
And knowing what it is.
As I said in the comments, I don't know that you've answered. Oh, Jock's just popped a comment in. I think power is part of the answer to Pete's last question. Yeah, it seems.
Sorry, what is the comment?
Jock's put in the chat, I think power is part of the answer to Pete's last question.
Yes, definitely. Definitely, yeah.
Just randomly thinking about the power and equity in the work that I'm doing around communication in social change movements. There's lots of synergies in this work too, Yazdan. So as usual, we're all thinking about things in really divergent ways, which is so interesting, and the value of this exercise. Has anybody got anything else they would like to add or contribute to the discussion? It's been really lovely seeing everybody again and having this wonderful space to think and talk about thinking. I mean, how lucky are we to have that? So it's great everyone's here doing that today. And yeah, I'm just opening the floor if anyone else would like to add some final comments.
Maybe also potentially the domino effect of this, you know, emergence of identity, creating another identity. Like, you know, when we talk about kids, I'm coming from a very practical perspective, I suppose. The fandom.
Yeah.
Yes.
They create a new
Stan culture.
Yes, and also a new leisure group. Like, you know, the gamers, they have I don't know, personas and emojis and, you know, whatever the personification, and that creates new identity yet again, the different group of people who, for example, now the digital artists, for example,
being in
the
cozy gaming versus
Yeah.
RPGs versus
Yeah.
it's a
Your
massive-
research is gonna be never ending.
No.
Yes, that-
It goes on until my retirement. Yeah.
The long list.
Narrativizing your own story and
Yeah.
re-narrativizing it and like you're constantly reimposing,
Yes.
like re-establishing power if you can. If
Yes.
you're in a position where you can tell your story in that way,
Yes.
people are not. So yeah.
Exactly.
So yes, there are
Yeah.
a few comments, not
Yeah.
comments, like people who are
I think
thanking
some
you.
people give
Thank
up
you.
power on purpose, though, because to some people, the idea of power is a stressful thing. And so some people prefer passivity, which is, I think, why a lot of younger people think that looking at social media is a freaking hobby, even though I don't agree with that.
Yeah.
I'd like to
I think we
request a feminist perspective on
Yeah.
that, please.
Yeah.
Yes, why not? I put it in my list. Yeah.
I think if once you drop the power bomb,
Because we put our football heroes as heroes
Above our quilters.
above our quilters and our knitters and
Yes.
our hand weavers.
Definitely. Yeah. I'll add it to my list.
Oh, yeah. We've got plenty of ideas for you. Thank you,
We-
everybody, for joining. Sorry, Wasim, are you still going? I didn't
No,
see
no,
you.
sorry, please go ahead.
Please contribute. Oh.
We're just putting in requests for future research.
Oh,
So
excellent. Okay.
we will name one of the rooms in building 26 after whom.
Thank you.
After
Yeah,
female
all
body.
these bloke.
Yeah, so all of these halls, you know, so we will name one of the, hopefully, one of the names.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you Wagga people enjoy the celebrations and your gathering together, and everyone else, lovely to see you, and have the lovely rest of your afternoon and great week. See you soon. Thanks for joining.
See you.
Bye, Yazdan.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.